Good evening. I'd like to call to order the Lakewood City Council study session in the city of Lakewood, Colorado on April 15th, 2019, 7 p.m. in council chambers. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Hall.
Here.
Roybal.
Here.
Gutwein. Here. Skilling. LeBure.
Here.
Abel.
Here.
Vincent. Beta. Johnson.
I'm here.
Franks.
Here.
Harrison.
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right. Well, fantastic. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you taking the time to come out. Looks like a friendly group this evening for our study session, but I will just ask if you do have a cell phone to please put it on silent. And will the clerk please read item 3?
Item 3, Proclamation National Volunteer Month.
Okay, so we have some folks here. I'm going to ask Carla Grant to come down and join me. And if you all want to come down.
Yeah.
I mean, you made it this far. And then as soon as you get down here, we will ask Mayor Pro Tem Abel to please read the proclamation for National Volunteer Month. Come on, fill it in. You're good. You want to face that way?
Which way do you want
There,
us to
no,
face?
we're going to look this way. The camera will see everybody looking that way. All right, here we go. We got plenty of room, too.
Oh, here, would you like?
There we go.
April 2019 National Volunteer Month. Whereas National Volunteer Month provides us the opportunity to celebrate the contributions of those who generously give their time and talents to improve their communities, and whereas the government alone cannot meet all of our nation's needs, so we partner with businesses, faith-based organizations, nonprofit organizations, foundations, and individuals who serve in the city government and in our community to make a difference. And whereas last year more than 1,000 volunteers gave their time in service to the city of Lakewood, which totaled over 57,800 hours, and whereas these hours served are valued at $1,426,504, and whereas Lakewood volunteers serve in many capacities, including bailiffs in our municipal courts, youth sports coaches, nature ambassadors at Bear Creek Park, ushers at the Lakewood Cultural Center, victims advocates with the police department, tour guides at the Heritage Center, and they can be found at each special event in the city of Lakewood hosts. And whereas the city of Lakewood deeply appreciates its volunteers and encourages citizens to become aware of and involved in their communities, neighborhoods, and local government, now therefore on behalf of the City Council and the people of Colorado, he, Adam Paul, Mayor of the City of Lakewood, Colorado, by virtue of the authority vested in me, do hereby recognize all volunteers in the City of Lakewood.
All right. This is fantastic, and many of us had the opportunity to come to a dinner last week and honor some of you for what you do, and you get to see those numbers, $1.4 million just last year. So we are incredibly grateful and thankful for all of your service and what you do. You greet everybody with a smile, and you do this because you care and love our city. So it's a great pleasure to honor you, and if you'd like the mic.
I'm going to say a quick
All right.
Well, thank you, City Council and Mayor Adam Paul, for the proclamation. We really appreciate you guys acknowledging all of the wonderful volunteers within the city. They value you guys, they value the city, and you guys help support them, and they enjoy it as a family. So thank you. And to anyone who is interested in becoming a volunteer and joining our ranks, can always make a plug. Please, it's easy to sign up. You can visit lakewood.org/volunteer, quick application, and we can get you started. So thank you guys very much.
So at our study sessions, we do things a little bit different. We have an opportunity for public input to speak to or give any sort of input based on the presentation you just heard. Nobody has indicated a desire to speak on our wonderful volunteers. So I will close that opportunity unless anybody says otherwise. All right. Thank you all very, very much. And will the clerk please read item 4?
Item 4, presentation, City Attorney's Office report.
All right. So this came through as a council request from Councilor Franks to have kind of overall view of what our city attorney's office does and kind of all the different areas that it operates in. And so this is an educational opportunity for the council and community. And I will turn it over to Mr. Jeff Dolan from our Employee Relations Department.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. Good evening. This evening, we're going to provide you with a report out on a assessment that was conducted by my department regarding the City Attorney's Office, their structure, their functions, how they are designed. And I wanted to at least start with a little bit of an introduction in case you haven't worked with me very much. My name is Jeff Dolan. I've been with the City of Lakewood going on 5 years. Next month will be my 5-year anniversary. My background, I've been in local government and private sector for a little over 20 years. And I've had an opportunity to work with very large organizations, some small, mid-sized organizations. And the discussion we're having tonight is really common for virtually every company, whether it's public sector or private sector. With me tonight is Corey Peterson. Corey joined our organization about 2 years ago. Corey has a very distinguished background. If you wouldn't mind Corey standing up. Corey is a retired Air Force colonel, and in his 26 years of public service in the Air Force, he had some exciting opportunities in his career. One of the things that he had done, obviously, in the world of the military, they get exposed to things on a global scale. Corey worked for NATO, building out effective organizations and training leaders all across the country and all over the world about how to build and develop organizations that are efficient and effective. So we're very fortunate to have Corey as part of our team here in Lakewood, and he's been very involved in this. We've also had a number of my team that have been involved in the research and collecting of information and helping us compile this. If you recall, we started the work in late January, and so we've really been hustling to get a bunch of information together, outreach to other communities across the state and across the region. And so I apologize, we weren't able to give you a lot of heads up on the data. A lot of that came from the fact that we were trying to squeeze as much information as we can as long as we could. So I will make sure that my presentation is available to all of you as well as on the website so that we can have ongoing conversations. Just as a little bit of a setup of what brought us to this point and what do organizational assessments mean. I think it's important that as we talk about organizational assessments that I provide a little bit of a framework. Organizational assessments really are designed to have a systemic review of how an organization is designed. We look at what supports the organization. We look at elements that how an organization is designed is not just about an org structure, but it's about an organizational function. So know that every organization is made up of a lot of complex different systems and a lot of complex elements that are codependent upon each other. In my organization, in my profession, and as an HR person, we look at that and we have a label for that. We call that an organizational matrix. And just to give you some examples of things that we look at when we're looking at designing an organization or interfacing with an organization, there's things like a functional chart. You'll hear me talk about an org chart. You'll hear me talk about service delivery models. You'll hear us look at or talk about customer service delivery models. We talk about technology strategy. We talk about budget strategies. We talk about how we integrate staffing. We talk about how we connect a communication plan with the stakeholders. And so those are all layers of information that when we look at an organization, we try to look at through those through a bunch of different filters in a bunch of different ways. In short, the process that we go through as an HR profession is we try to frame up 3 primary categories. We look at organizational priorities, we look at an organizational function, and we look at the organizational capacity. And all 3 of those big level strategies all kind of come together. And so as we start looking at any operation, we want to make sure that we are paying attention to the data points that come in. We want to look at the competition that is out there. What are the other organizations doing? We do an operational assessment, and those happen all the time. And it's really important for me to make sure, Council, you know that as an HR team, we talk about organizational assessments frequently. Not always in front of council, but we frequently talk about it because we have a very healthy organization and our culture embraces innovation. We embrace change. We embrace things that make an organization a good place to work. And we are a heck of a good place to work. So we're happy to be able to do that. Why do leaders do assessments? There's a lot of reasons why organizational leaders do assessments. Here's a few. When we do assessments for our leadership team and for you, there's things that you just don't necessarily know about. Unless you live and breathe and work within that operation, you may not have a knowledge about all of the elements and all the things that go into play when you're overseeing a function. It really helps leaders stay in touch with new trends. You have an opportunity to see, well, what's out there, what's different. Helps leaders understand codependencies. So in my world, we look at that as good idea, bad execution. We want to make sure that the things that work really well within an organization, we know what makes them work. We want to know why they work well, and we don't want to mess those things up. Right? We like constant process improvement, we like innovation, we like those things, but we also want to make sure that we share information with the leadership team and council in this case so that you are aware, should you want to make any changes, what are some of the codependencies, right? We don't want to have what we call a ripple effect. Good idea with a good intention and downstream without thinking about it, we accidentally create either a customer service reduction or a response reduction, things like that. So we work diligently to make sure that as we go through these types of assessments, we're trying to balance a bunch of those elements. Other things that I think are important to understand, what can assessments be used for? And we use them for all sorts of things within the operations, but a couple of 3 kind of simple things. You can help to align your priorities. And this council has been spending a fair amount of time over the last couple of years talking about what are our priorities and is staff aligned to our priorities. So this is a great opportunity to gather a bunch of information, additional perspective, and then ensure that we're aligned to your priorities. Long-term staffing strategy. You hear us talk a lot about workforce planning, hear us talk a lot about succession planning. Look at, well, are we staffed accordingly? Do we have enough capacity doing the right type of work with the right skills? So we talk about that a lot. Informing you on budget decisions. Lakewood, we seem to be in a perpetual budget cycle, either planning for it or executing on it or assessing whether we are effective with our budget goals. So this is another really good way for leaders and especially to have a better understanding of what could you use some of this information for. Over the years, I found kind of a 3-phase process that I lead department heads through and other parts of the business through. And the first phase is the what. What is this? What does this mean? Think of the what phase as a white paper or a glorified book report. Okay? Heavy on data, heavy on content, a lot of information about the organization. Very few finite outcomes. Very few finite conclusions, due largely to the number of variables. One of the outcomes that assessments will provide you is this, if you think about it as a spaghetti plate, all the intertwined functions and priorities and strategies are all tied together. And if you pull the wrong one the wrong way, you end up with kind of a mess. So we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to understand all of those things. Lastly, in the what phase, things that I have found in my time is it's usually really boring for everybody involved except for the department that's undergoing the assessment and the HR team that's assigned to it, because largely these are things that we like to do. We've been trained to do it, and we get we like to help. And so know that there's really very few people that really love doing assessments. It gets scary for staff to go through these things. It gets anxious for council as you guys are looking at all this data. So know that we're just in the first step here of what's going on, what does it look like. The second phase really is the so what, quote unquote, so what. So what does this mean? We like to think of that as what's working well, what do we need to change, and if we do want to change, what do we want to change? And what are the outcomes that we're trying to accomplish? What are we willing to invest in? What are we willing to give up on? And so when we start looking at organizational, the second stage of the what's next, those are the things as a leadership team you want to think about and you want to plan for. The third phase is the now what. And the now what for us is really focused around the implementation. We want to look at what are all of the actions that need to be, that are being considered? And let's deliberately look at those so that we understand if this, then that. If we make this change in service delivery model, if we introduce this new piece of technology, does that change the interaction from a citizen calling in and getting a warm person on the phone? Those are examples of things that we want to make sure if we change our service delivery model for any of our services, not just city attorney, but in general, if we change any of our service delivery model, we want to be deliberate about it so that we don't create a different problem further downstream. We like to have mitigation plans, so if something were to happen, anytime we use third-party providers or vendors, and should something happen, we like to have a plan. So the now what stage really helps us get into the details of what should we be focusing on. In general, the impacts of assessments, there's a few. The first one is we generate a significant amount of information, significant amount. So you're going to hear me tonight talk about layers of detail. I'm going to add a layer of detail. We're going to drill into the next layer of detail. One of the things that's really important as you go through this process is it's really easy to get lost in the details. It's really easy. So we've learned that some people are visual learners, and we learned that some people are contextual learners, so we have to talk about it. And we know some people just need to be able to read it. So know that if at any point in our conversation throughout this evening, if I've lost you, please make sure that during the question and answer that I can clarify and make sure that we are on the same page. I have put in some pictures, some visuals to help us, and a lot of times that's more so for me than others, but just know. There is anxiety anytime we do assessments, and that's logical, and it's a rational thing, and so you have that comes up in any organization that we do that. But the good side of that is there's a lot of excitement that comes up, and we call that the what if. What if we fill in the blank? What if we fill in the blank? And so those are things that, having gone through massive organizational redesigns and massive organizational structure changes, both public and private, that's the part that when you get to that stage, the what if, we call the cloud kind of raises, and the fog kind of, people come out of the fog, and we can actually talk about what if we fill in the blank. And so those are the things that, as we think about the three phases of an assessment, know that we're in the first phase here of what. And so I'm going to be sharing a lot of information. You can tell that I'm a high context communicator, so I do like to give you a lot of information, but I will try to frame that in a way that allows us to go forward. And that was even the first slide. So tonight, I'm going to walk us through just a handful, 30 or 40 minutes worth of information. And our agenda is going to follow above, or I guess in front of you. We're going to talk about the Lakewood Charter. We're going to talk about the scope of the assessment. Scope's very important because scope keeps us focused and doesn't allow us to stray too far into one direction or another direction, so scope is important. The process that we followed, so I think that's helpful, it's transparent. It's a pretty consistent process, as I described earlier. The City Attorney Office overview, so there's a whole bunch of information there. There's about 22 slides full of information that you're going to love. The financial overview, we're going to look at a 5-year spend as well as how we use some of our outside counsel, so you get a preview of what that looks like. And then some comparables. We're going to talk about some of the information that we gathered through talking to other cities, other counties in the state, outside of the state, our size, a little smaller, a little bit bigger, a lot bigger. And we'll talk a little bit about those things. Our Lakewood Charter is very explicit. I highlighted a handful of things. You're going to see tonight, I'm going to start with the charter, I'm going to end with the charter, because those are the two frameworks that our city attorney's office follows. The city attorney reports directly to the city council. You have two employees, two direct employees, the city manager and the city attorney. And I'll highlight just a couple of things. 4.6A talks about the city attorney shall serve at the pleasure of the city council and at the compensation fixed by the city council. That kind of gives you your authority to move and establish a position. B, the city attorney shall have the chief legal counsel of the city and the legal advisor to city council, city manager, all of our departments, the city and boards and commissions. So that is important to know too, because it kind of gives you a good breadth of experience and scope of authority that the city attorney specifically has. The city attorney shall appoint, promote, suspend, transfer, remove city employees of the city attorney's office in accordance with our provisions of the personnel merit system. This is the ability to hire and fire. So those are elements that allows you guys as the leaders and the governing body to have anchor with the city attorney. The scope of assessment. For those of you that don't know me, I over-engineer everything, and so this has been a labor of love to spring this all the way down and bring this into a nice, simple document. So our scope, we focused on four primary things: organizational design and development and operation. We identified the functional areas. That's really helpful to know because you get this wonderful view of all of the work by function that they do. We define the service delivery models. We talk about what does that look like. We actually look at the services, the volume of work, the complexity and the nature of work. So anytime we do work in the HR world, we want to know the volume of work, but also the complexity, because you can have 122 tasks to be done, but if they only take 5 minutes apiece versus 3 tasks to do that take 3 months apiece. So we want to understand the complexity of the work as well. The financial overview, 5-year review of that, as well as the contract financial terms. We're going to look at the comparison of other communities, the legal function designs, their models, but also some of the operating budgets around there. I have a tremendous amount of information in detail. I've tried to the best of my ability to roll this up into an executive report for City Council. Should you have an interest into digging into any other specific details or follow-up, I would encourage you guys to, by all means, let me know what that looks like. The process that we followed is, again, a fairly standard process. Stakeholder intake sessions. Stakeholders are any individual, any group, any person that was identified in the charter, but also is tied to the city attorney's office. So we conducted interviews with the departments. We did that in a couple of different ways. We sent out a survey to all of our department heads and said, tell us all the legal services that you're being provided, whether that's in-house or an outside counsel. We looked at the high volume users of city attorney's office. For example, our purchasing area, we spend a fair amount of capacity working in contracts. It was really important for us to get a better sense of what that looks like and how that plays. Operational review, finance department did a thorough review of the legal spend, and so there's a lot of information in there. And then my department did a capacity analysis and workload analysis. And so what that really allows us to do is we start to split out the individuals within the department and what do they spend their time on, because that gives you a nice three-dimensional view of what that looks like. And I'll share some of the outcomes there. The community comparable data, I mentioned it a little bit before, the local governments within the region. We did talk to them specifically around trying to compare Lakewood to their operation. One of the things that is very clear anytime we do assessment work is every organization does virtually the same type of work, but how they do that is different. And that's something that I think you'll see come through as we talk about some of the layers of detail. We did some industry research just to see what's some of the current trends, what's the bleeding edge trending, and what's kind of the norm, what does that look like? We'll share some of that information with you as well. Overview of the legal services. The city attorney, the duties are defined in the charter. They report to you as a city council. They're responsible for the management of all aspects of the city attorney's office as defined. We have two primary divisions, the civil division, which supports the operations of the organization. And I have a great picture that you'll see that. They also take direction from the city attorney. So the civil, the deputy city attorney who reports to the city attorney We have one civil division, civil law. The second division is the criminal law division. And we don't always talk a lot about this. It's one of our largest parts. It is the largest part of the city attorney's office. And it was a wonderful opportunity. It's the first time I've had an opportunity to do a major deep dive into that side of any legal function. So we learned a great deal. Again, we have a deputy city attorney that leads the prosecution activities for all of our city municipal courts. That function is really integrated with the police department upstream, but also with the courts downstream. So as you think about the municipal courts, our city attorney's office is literally integrated from consulting and advising at the front end all the way to prosecuting and going to trial. So it's interesting, and it's interesting to people like me. They provide a lot of advice and guidance to the police department. It's phenomenal, the amount of advice and walk-in traffic and access that the police department has with our city attorney's office. They also take direct direction from the city attorney. So again, it's a direct report. There are 3 branches of government, as you know. We put this visual in there because I think it's great for the public to see this as well. Executive, legislative, and judicial. Those are the 3 branches of government. As you look at that, the civil law division supports 2. They support the executive, which is the city manager and all the departments. And they also support the legislative, which is you, this body. The criminal law side of the division supports specifically the judicial. There's a little bit of a overlap into the operations, primarily because they support the police department and provide legal advice. But primarily their core function is designed around supporting the municipal courts and the judicial side. You'll see underneath that there are a couple of arrows, parens that kind of link them together. Again, the city attorney is responsible for providing the strategy and oversight for all 3 of those branches. This is a visual of the organizational structure. You can see this is an org chart that we have modified to put a lot of information on there because it's relevant to drawing the picture. You can see the city attorney at the top. That's 1 full-time equivalent. FTE is a full-time equivalent. And that's relevant because you'll see in here we have a individual that's split 0.5, 0.5. Those aren't 2 different people. That's 1 person doing dual function. So in my profession, we use full-time equivalents just so it's easier for us to explain. The civil, executive, and legislative, you see 1.5 full-time equivalents built into there. And then on the criminal side, which is also the judicial side of the house, you'll see 9.5 full-time equivalent employees in that space. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see the org chart itself. So you'll see the city attorney, the deputy city attorney on the left on civil law, and the deputy city attorney on the criminal on the right. You'll see halfway down on the right side there, a box that's colored in 2 different colors. That position is part of our ongoing strategy to cross-train and to do some succession planning. So the city attorney's office is one of those areas where it's hard to find exceptionally great talent. And once we get them, we love to develop them. We want them to stay a very long time. So part of that is professional development. The other part of that is there's a fair amount of demand for work and capacity need on the other side of it. So that decision was made approximately a year ago. You'll see on the bottom there a box that's called outside legal counsel for specialized support. We did we compiled a bunch of information across the business about who's using outside counsel and what kind of services are they using. It's important to note that when we look at specialized counsel, that's not uncommon. Virtually every city across the country has specialties. Even organizations, I came from the city and county of Denver, one of the largest internal in-house legal firms, they still on occasion have a need to outsource to certain types of specialties. So there's a highly specialized areas that every organization runs into. I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. I'm adding a layer of detail now. So as we look at the civil law workload, so this again is the left side of that organizational chart. When we did the workforce workload analysis, we asked them, tell us a little bit where you spend your time. 52% of the time is being invested in contracts and intergovernmental agreements. The next largest piece of that is general legal advice. That's where the departments are reaching out and asking questions. Can I do this? What does this mean? How does this work? Things along those lines. The next large section is city council. So again, this is the deputy city attorney supporting and assisting the city attorney on city council matters. The remaining core requests, although the Colorado Open Records Act seems like a small thing, it is a fairly significant area of growth within the city attorney's office. When we look at the volume of core requests and requests for information year over year, that is one of the fastest growing requests for legal services within the organization. So nothing unusual, it's just part of the data that we found. As we move to the criminal law workload, again, this is the top pie chart is the deputy city attorney. And as we look at that, 40% of the deputy city attorney's time is being spent invested in providing advice and guidance to the Lakewood Police Department. That's really an amazing thing. I would tell you that in our experience, my experience and some of the data we look at, because we have a strategy that integrates our city attorney, deputy city attorney, far up into the decision-making chain within the police department, there's no doubt that we're avoiding a significant amount of risk throughout kind of downstream. So we're really glad to see that. 25% of the time is being spent on miscellaneous. That miscellaneous could be anything from from training to writing, researching, things along those lines. You'll notice in the 25% there's training. The deputy city attorney invests a tremendous amount of time training. Again, historically speaking, our city attorney's office in the criminal side is invested and integrated into all of our brand new police agents. When they come on, they get trained. They're part of the academy. They're part of the in-service, but they're also part of the civilian side of the house. So they spend a fair amount of time training. As we move down to the bottom left there, you'll see the investigators. The investigators have one of the hardest jobs. It's exceptionally task-oriented. There's a tremendous amount of information that they compile. They have to prepare for trials, motions, and court hearings. That's their job. They have to go out and find all this information. They have to interview people. They have to compile all this information, regardless of whether or not the case goes into trial or not. They have to be prepared, and they are the priming pump for the prosecutors. They spend 20% of their time doing setup and miscellaneous casework. Some of you are lawyers, some of you have worked with lawyers, there's always a lot of paperwork anytime we're dealing with the court. If you look at the bottom right, you see prosecutors, 5.5 head count into that space. Arraignments and plea bargainings. Again, this is where our city attorney's office is interfacing with our citizens. Specifically in the courtroom, and the plea bargaining process and the arraignment process is a pretty significant amount of time, and it's quite honestly one of the most important. So if they do a really good job, what I learned is if they do a really good job at the front end and they're able to work with our citizens, the number of trials, the number of significant time investment of larger scale trials and hearings goes down drastically. So it's a wonderful opportunity. The trials and motions, again, there's let me take one step back. There's roughly 16,000, just to give some context, there's roughly 16,000 cases that come through at one point or another throughout the year, and that's both with the courts and with the prosecutors. They have to prep for that volume of work. The trials and motions, again, of that 16,000, a percentage of them go through. As they go through, the prosecutors have to be prepared. Again, they don't show up on the day of trial and not be prepared. So they go through the motion even if right before the case goes to trial, it gets settled. So again, very prepared and very impressive. So this is what we call a lollipop diagram. And I'm a visual person, and so for those of you that are not visual, you can giggle at me for a little while, but I like lollipop because this allows us to take a very complex organization within the city attorney's office, and we break it into these functions. Within our organization, across our organization, we use this strategy to identify across the entire enterprise all of the functions across every department and every division. So we can quickly and accurately report to the city manager the status of any division or any function. We overlay our workforce plan on top of that, so we have a really good sense of where do we spend our capacity, who's going to retire, where are we at risk for functional. So know that the lollipop diagram is really designed just to provide us a framework to share information. As I go through this, I'm going to have 6 slides. On the top right-hand corner of each slide, you'll see which section we're in. I will go clockwise, so that way you can follow in case you get read ahead. Not that you can't read ahead, because I'm controlling it. City Council support. So they draft and review municipal code. That's a pretty heavy lift. Anytime council decides to add or create municipal codes and or change it. Provide general legal advice. Again, those are elements about day-to-day actions. Jump down a little bit there, oversee quasi-judicial procedures. Those are not frequent, but when they occur, they're fairly time-consuming and complex. The legal research, this is, again, something that when you have an innovative council that's looking at new ideas and new things, there's always the opportunity and need to do additional research. And supporting special projects. A lot of the regional work that Lakewood is involved in, a lot of the work that the police department gets involved in, not just within our local, but within the feds, they get involved with a lot of those special projects. Outside council supervision. This is one of the things that, because we have a hybrid model, we use outside counsel. City Attorney's Office, and specifically our City Attorney, is responsible for developing and coordinating our litigation strategy. Anytime we are sued or we have pending litigation, City Attorney's Office is responsible for developing that strategy. And that strategy can be as simple as, are we going to defend it or are we not going to defend it? Are we going to keep that in-house or are we going to outsource that? Anytime we have an event that occurs with multiple citizens or multiple interested parties, and we have multiple councils involved, the complexity of that, as you can imagine, multiplies. And so City Attorney's Office is the primary point of contact for all of our coordination. They provide legal specialty and policy coordination. There's a ton of policies that come along. So one of the things within the legal profession is if you say you're going to do it, then your policy better reflect that you're doing it that way, right? And so internally, they're very supportive of how we do our work. So they make sure that if we're going to say our policies look this way, are we actually doing that? Next section, civil law. This is a monster. And this is the entire civil law division. So if you recall, this is roughly 1.5 FTE. And these are all of the different functions. And I'd like to highlight any one of these functions has conservatively 5 to 10 subset tasks associated with accomplishing any one of these. And so I raised that for you guys just so, one, you have a visual of all of the elements that are moving. And two, because I'd like to acknowledge the work that you have ahead of you of trying to figure out, well, what's our long-term strategy? This is really where the rubber meets the road. Where do we accomplish work and how do we want to accomplish it? I'm not going to read all of it. I'll highlight a few of them for you. By charter, they advise the council, city manager, and department heads. That's one of the primary things. And that can be drop-in sessions. That can be any number of things, proactive or reactive. Reviewing claims against the city. We get sued a fair amount of time. The world nowadays is a little bit more litigious than it was historically in the past. But again, we are supported by our city attorney's office for that. Providing legal advice to city staff. Again, that's not simply department heads. We have division managers that are frequently in the enforcement space, civilians that are having to interpret policy and practice and apply it to a situation within our community. In-house legal training is another thing that is what we would call an enhanced service, but it's one of those things that if we're going to be proactive and reduce our risk for being sued, providing education and training to our managers and supervisors and division managers, very important. Providing land use and zoning advice, that's one of the things that although it may not be a high frequency, it's a high level of effort and a high complexity. Virtually any land use and zoning discussion, as you guys have experienced, there's always strings and it's always a complex thing and it's virtually impossible to navigate it without our lawyers. Draft and review contracts, again, 52% of our capacity is currently being focused around contract management and contract review. Again, as an organization, we join in contracts with a number of organizations across the state and country. So it's a pretty significant level of effort. Administrative functions. Providing an annual report that's also integrated in the city attorney's annual review, or at least it has been in recent years. Performing legal documentation management. The files, managing legal files, as you guys can imagine, is cumbersome, and it's one of those things where it takes a fair amount of capacity, not only to capture it, but also to manage it and being able to find it when you need it. Managing city attorney's office staff schedule. Again, you look at the complexities of we're not very deep. We don't have a tremendous amount of bench strength. Making sure that people are available when council needs them to be available or city manager needs them to be available. That's an area that we do focus on. I talked a little bit already about the police legal advice, but just to highlight a couple of them off of this slide. The criminal justice records, again, those are things that seem simple but are not as easy as you and I would think. The litigation support for the police department. When our law enforcement are involved in doing their job, sometimes people don't always appreciate the care and approach that we have, and so on occasion we do have individuals who file complaints against us, and so the legal department does support that in any way. Managing the sex offender registry is something that is, again, a lot larger level of effort than I previously had an understanding or appreciation for, and having spent some time with our deputy, you really have a better understanding of all of the ins and outs and paperwork that's associated with that. I talked a little bit about the in-service, but I'd like to overemphasize the investment that city attorney's office on the criminal side makes with educating our new agents, and then the in-service. Any laws that change, any practices that change, any awareness that needs to happen, they take the lead on that. So very important. Criminal law. Liquor license hearings, witness and victim interviews. I spent a fair amount of time planning for and attending criminal appeals. Again, that's something that we must be prepared for. Attending trials. Last but not least, reviewing criminal charges with police agents. The pre-work that is done by our city attorneys on the criminal side, the pre-work is pretty extensive. They do a lot of that work up front, again, in hopes that as we get into the municipal courts, that our agents are prepared, the prosecutors are prepared. This is your lollipop again, so we've gone around the full circle. And just again, to give you kind of an oversight and in-view of that operation. A little bit about the financial review. We provided 5 years of information around the budget versus actuals. And we also included some information on there around the outside legal counsel. One of the things that I think is helpful to know about is when we look at outside legal counsel, that really is one of those elements that it's really hard to predict per se, and it's really hard to budget for. However, when something significant occurs and we're in a position where we are working with again a number of different attorneys, those costs can quickly go up. And you're probably aware of a number of them, but you'll see they kind of ebb and flow year over year. As we look at the contract highlights, there's a couple things just to raise. In 2016, the contract was renewed, and so most of you have probably been aware of that or seen what the agreement is with Tim Cox's firm. But just to give you a quick highlight of what that looks like, the contract itself is with Michelle Cox and McCaskin. The core term of the agreement is 4 days legal support for 4 days, and that is a separate bill. We get a bill every month for those 4 days of service. Additionally to that, we have support continues beyond the 4 days. So the city attorney's office support doesn't stop on Wednesdays or on Saturdays or Sundays. They continue to support our needs when called upon. But know that when that occurs, specifically on that fifth day, there is a billable, and it's a billable by hour event. A couple things to highlight in that. Wednesdays, council meetings, and any other hours that we use from the lawyers at the firm are all billed at that rate, and we receive a secondary bill. The second bullet there really is just to give you a trend over the last 3 years of what that number looks like. One of the things I think that's important for you to hear, when you look at numbers, one of the things that I think that I've learned through negotiations is as soon as you put numbers on there, the conversation changes. And as soon as you see the number, you only see the number. So let me just provide a little context. The numbers that you see up there are actual numbers, the right numbers, but they're not the salary that the city attorney himself receives. So there's fees that go into the firm that cover overhead, they cover the rent, and it covers health insurance for their employees, things like that. So know that although we're billed at that rate, that's not his established, he doesn't take that home. The third bullet there, on the second bullet, you'll see the trend is pretty consistent between, we annualized 2016 to be roughly 309, 2017, we're at 296, and 2018, we're at 299. So again, as an organization, our fixed cost for the city attorney, the chief legal advisor, is fairly consistent related to that. The third bullet there is the other fees. So that's the other Michelle, Cox, and McCaskin attorney services. So that could be anything from attending city council meetings. It could be special projects, new legislation, research. It can be a number of different things. Litigation management, workers' comp, any number of our employment. We use them largely for employment as well. So anytime we have unemployment hearings or things like that, they are our legal advisors. One thing I'd highlight is in 2018, you saw a jump from 36,622 to 78,140. As we look into that a little bit, there's a couple of drivers of that, and I thought I would share some of that information with you. The primary drivers, there's three primary drivers. The first one is the volume of the projects that City Attorney's Office was specifically getting into. There were new legislation, so in 2018, you were a very active council and generated a fair amount of new legislation. That work was consumed largely through the city attorney's office and the firm. The increase in city council meetings, just hours. Many of you know you spend a fair amount of time in this wonderful room, and so those are hours that are billed separately. And then just as a guiding principle, we as an organization are consistently impacted, as the rest of the nation is, with litigation. So across the country, there's been an increased number of kind of a trend in litigation. We're not immune from that, but as that happens. So those are three of the drivers of what we learned drove the difference between 17 and 18. Within the industry, a couple things to talk a little bit about. There are basically three models, and they're pretty common. The in-house model is exactly what it says. All legal services are brought in-house. Or the vast majority of legal services are brought in-house. And organizations, both public and private, use that information, and they'll decide whether or not they want to bring it in-house. I will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Outsource model, an organization completely outsources it. They do not have one lawyer on staff, and the entire business has been outsourced. Not uncommon with the smaller organizations, and it's actually on the bleeding edge of innovation. We're starting to see what's called a LPO, a legal process outsourcing. So these very large conglomerate organizations who have learned how to outsource virtually everything. You're starting to see them outsource their legal functions to India and some of the other countries that are pretty popular with outsourcing offshore. So that's something that is, it's a growing trend. The LPO industry is expected to be a $40 billion industry by the year 2024. So don't think that'll quite get to local government in the next 10 years, but that's something that is bleeding edge. The hybrid model, which is clearly what the city of Lakewood uses, is an organizational blending strategy of both in-house and outsourced. And so there's a bunch of information that really lives with the city council to say, well, what do we want to have? How do we want to, where do we want to blend that? How do we want to blend that? Things like that. But know that within the industry, those are the three primary practices across the service. I'm going to spend a minute talking a little bit about comparable research. And so a few things that I would like to highlight, again, as setup, because I'm an HR person, I think setup is important and context is important. As I get into the data, there's a few things that I want to be on record of saying ahead of time, and I do this with all of my customers and all of my department heads. It's important that for me to tell you that when we study an organization, every organization is unique, every single one. There's additional context that is really difficult to drill into and get a better understanding of what that actually means unless you come up from that organization or into that organization. Each organization we spoke to as we studied, they use data different. They use information different. They have a series of decision-making that they use to determine what their litigation strategy and legal strategy should be. We use this assessment as an opportunity in a process to identify what other organizations did, but it's really, again, it's really hard to be able to compare an apple to an apple because in some cases an apple is an orange and an orange is a banana because of the size of the organization, the risk tolerance, things like that. Staff, as much as we attempted to draw in some conclusions, I hesitate to stand in front of you and say I can correlate, I can give you a statistical correlation between A and B or C and D. And so it's important for me to be able to tell you that I have static data and it's information that is just information, and what it means to us is going to be different based on how you perceive it and how you want to use it going forward. And so staff has no expectation and is in no way, shape, or form attempting to lead you to a conclusion. So it's important for me to make sure you have a working knowledge of that. There are variables as we talk to other organizations, the bigger organizations, the smaller organizations. There's a lot of different things that happen. Operationally, there's 3 or 4 variables that happen when we do assessments and we start talking to other businesses. For example, if we talk to an organization that has an airport, right? They have different needs, different operations. If they have solid waste, if they do garbage collection, if they are operating a library, if they are operating a fire department, if they're operating services that we don't per se have, a wastewater treatment plant. That's something in my first employer, we had a wastewater treatment plant. That changes the whole world because the staffing needs and the legal needs are different. So know that as we go in it and we talk to different organizations, we're aware that sometimes we're talking an apple to an orange. Different organizations have different risk tolerances. And so that's important just for me to frame because risk tolerance is something that, especially in the legal profession, is the primary driver of cost. It's the primary driver of staffing. It's the primary driver for most organizations to decide should we have services in-house or should we outsource it. So risk tolerance, do we, for example, fight every claim that comes forward, and do you fight it to the last dying breath? If you choose to do that as an organization, typically that's going to be a high cost of litigation and defense, and so in many cases in that scenario, it might be worth investing in a whole bunch of staff to defend every single claim. On the other side of the equation, some organizations settle for every time they come across a case or a situation that they don't like to hear or they don't want to be involved in. They choose to completely get out of the litigation world and they'll try to settle at all costs. So know that that paradigm exists, and so some of these organizations may staff up really heavy. Some of them may run pretty lean, primarily because they have a different risk tolerance. The elected body has different priorities, to be fair. Some councils and elected bodies want to generate a lot of new legislation, and legislation is not easy to do and it's not cheap to do. And so the more new that you do, the more capacity it takes to research and then pass and then defend. And so know that that's something that different organizations have different risk tolerances related to that. As I go back to the slides here and provide you a little bit of survey, we reached out to a number of organizations across not only Colorado, but across the region and across the Midwest. We asked we sent out surveys, we did phone calls, we hopped on the internet, we studied their budget books, we looked at their staffing reports, we looked at all that kind of stuff. My team was literally head down as late as a week and a half ago. They were still tracking down data. So know that we felt like we did a pretty good due diligence trying to gather some information. We framed our questions around 4 things. What form of government do you have? Is the chief legal counsel an employer or contractor? What legal functions are in-house versus outsourced? And what is the budget of your organization? Again, that's information that's pretty easy to access. It's information that helps draw a picture. Does it help us draw a conclusion? Not really. It just provides us additional context and additional perspective. One thing I would tell you, having gone through this process, most city attorneys don't like to talk about their function. And most of them, in most organizations, are very sensitive about sharing their information about what do we spend, who's spending it. And so when HR people, and quite honestly, we probably got further than most because we're like them. Most organizations, when we talk to them, they are a little bit standoffish. Are you trying to steal my people? Are you trying to, what are you trying to do? So know that as we went through that process, we had a number of organizations that were happy to help, but perhaps not send us all your information. So these were the communities that actually responded and we were able to gather information from. And you'll notice in there a couple of things. They're cities, they're counties. We have a local, we have a state presence, we have a regional presence. We have some organizations that are smaller than us. We have some organizations that are larger than us. We have some organizations that are significantly larger than us. Part of the reason we wanted to get that breadth and depth of review is because, one, if they're the ultra large, what are your strategies? And typically the larger the organization, the higher the demand, the higher the volume of work, but also the more frequent they have some of those one-offs. And so where most organizations outsource the legal for water rights, some of the bigger organizations may have enough of that work, a book of business, that they bring it in-house. And so we're trying to get a sense when we talk to these organizations, kind of what's that breaking point and what makes sense? Is there a logical cutover point? So again, it gives you kind of a sense of what that looks like, and we'll provide you just a little bit of information as we go through here. Of the organizations that responded and we spoke with, approximately 45% of them contract the chief legal counsel. So just under half of them contract that in. The remaining 55% bring it in-house. And so if you're looking for a bright line of everyone does it this way or everyone does it that way, I'm sorry to report, it's kind of not like that. There is some data, some of the data did indicate that the larger the organization, the more likely it was for them to bring the chief legal counsel in-house. However, that's not 100% across the board. But as a guiding principle, it's split right around 45-55. Several of the out-of-state organizations, the larger organizations, do have an in-house model, largely an in-house model. Again, going with the idea that the larger the enterprise and the larger the legal demand, the easier it is for them to staff, have a cost benefit to in-house their staff. So that's one thing. And the last, I think, data point that's relevant, at least for the council to hear, is that 100% of the organizations that we spoke to outsourced something. 1 specialty, 2 specialties, 10 specialties. Every organization at one point or another has that point where they look at the cost benefit and say, you know what, it's just not worth the in-house, we're gonna outsource it. It could be because of the complexity of the legal service that is needed. It could be because it only happens once every 5 years. It could be a number of different reasons, but 100% of them that we spoke to and talked to had that crossover point. When this slide is really designed to give you, again, just from the civil law perspective. So again, going back into context, this is the left side of the org chart where we have a head count that is designed to do just the civil law work. So as we compare here in Colorado, and again, the caveat being most of these organizations aren't a perfect match for us. they're similar, but they have different services. They have different things that happen. So again, don't read into it other than to say it's fairly static data. Aurora, which is a population of 366,000, has 14 attorneys, 3 litigators. So you kind of see that spot where the larger the organization, they actually bring on a litigator, and in that case, they have 3 of them. Douglas County, for example, has 9 attorneys, and they switched theirs to have 2 paralegals and 3 support staff. So again, looking at it most likely from a transactional, they probably understand there's a fair amount of transactional work. Where can we put that work, and how can that work be done? Fort Collins, which is closest to us in population, but differs from us because of some of the services they provide, have 11 city attorneys, 4 legal assistants, and 3 paralegals. It is what it is. There's no statement or value related to that. In our case, we have 2.5, which includes Tim Cox, so we added him into that side of the equation, the civil law side. And then as you go down, you'll see Thornton has 5 city attorneys, 3 legal assistants, and 1 paralegal. And Longmont, which is, again, just a sample of a smaller organization, 4 attorneys, 1 legal assistant, and 1 admin. Just to give you some comparisons, I pulled out just 2 of the data points on the larger organizations. Out of state, Overland Park, Kansas, 191,000 citizens, 4 attorneys. Again, as they look at their work, a large percentage of their work has been outsourced. Again, a lot of the transactional side. Gilbert, Arizona, which is significantly larger than us. Again, they have 4 attorneys and 1 paralegal. So the point of this slide is less to push you to any conclusion and more so to say different organizations have a different strategy, and each one of them through a process that you're starting right now, start to figure out, well, where do you want to be? What do you want to insource? What do you want to outsource? What services do you want to provide? How quickly do you want to provide those services? How do you want to actually deliver that? So know that that's a fair amount of information, and I delivered quite a bit of it to you. There's binders and binders and binders of other information. Again, I'll make this presentation available to all of you, and then again, I'll put this up on the internet. And then lastly, I'm going to leave the charter back up there just as a bookend. So we start with the charter. We're going to end with the charter because again, that hopefully will provide you some context around the conversation, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.
Great. Mr. Dolan, thank you very much for that thorough presentation and a lot of great information. As to the ins and outs of our city attorney's office, we have a full lineup here of folks who are willing and able and ready to try to address any questions. I want to emphasize for the discussion this evening, this is really focused on the model and the structure, and not any ongoing potential legal issues or things along those lines. So I want to make sure council is cognizant of that. That's not the place tonight, especially with anything ongoing in the legal world. We do have a public input opportunity. Nobody's signed up to offer any input on this, so I will close that now, and we'll begin with questions or comments. Ms. Franks.
Thanks, Mayor Paul, and thanks, Mr. Dolan. Appreciate all the information. Did want to go ahead and make sure that the community was aware that I think Mayor Paul mentioned it earlier. I had put in the request for the audit, and indeed, Mr. Dolan went through everything that I had requested in the audit was in the presentation. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that everything I asked to be in there was certainly in there and was complete. So thank you very much for that. I did want to kind of dig a little bit. You had on one of the slides the communities that had responded. Do you also have the list, or can you make that available as an addendum to the communities that we reached out to that did not respond? Okay, because I'd like to have that complete list. And then in the staffing numbers, I know that you had included our city attorney, but because there's those additional services which range from the 30,000s to the 60,000s, did that result in any head count that made it into any of the charts?
Would you mind asking that question again in
So when you did the FTEs, when we kind of went through all that very granularly, I know that you had factored in the city attorney in that, but there's additional services that come through his firm, and wanted to know, did that as a proportional of an FTE make it into any of those slides?
No, we separated out any of the outside counsel, so we categorize any work done by the firm as part of an outside counsel.
Good. I just wanted to make sure that was clear. And so then were those dollars rolled into the slide which showed all the outsourcing?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just wanted to make sure that all that trailed back. Thank you for that. When the percentage came up that 45% of them basically do a contracted arrangement. In their situation, is that contracted arrangement always the chief legal advisor, or were any of those where they performed another role, meaning that they didn't oversee and control the department, they performed a different role?
We specifically asked if it was the chief legal advisor, so that was the split. So the 45% reflects the top level city attorney.
Just you want to make sure, because I've done my own research on that, and I think that might, let's see. That does exhaust the questions I had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Skilling?
I don't have the slide in front of me, so I think it was called the comparable staffing levels, and it had the 45% number. Now, I understand that small jurisdictions, and there were some small ones on there, generally are going to be contract, because you're not going to pay an FTE, somebody in-house, to play solitaire all day, so I get that. However, some of those, we had Thornton's on there, Fort Collins, Aurora. Out of those, how many of those are in-house? Because 45% doesn't really tell us too much. So speaking of the cities that are close to us, maybe 100,000 and above, how many of those are in-house versus contract?
When we look at the, and I've got our spreadsheet here, as I look at that, I think it's 6, let me double count here. Yeah, 6 of the 13 are outsourced contracts.
Which ones are that? Do you have those right there?
Castle Rock, Centennial, Golden, Longmont, Louisville, Westminster, and Douglas County. So
Okay.
fairly small organizations.
Okay, so those are on the smaller side. And so the corollary would be that the larger organizations on that list have the in-house?
Correct. The rest of the rest that, based on our information, the rest would be in-house.
You had mentioned earlier when we were talking about the 300,000 to Mr. Cox, I think you had said that he doesn't take that home, that goes towards overhead to the firm. Can you clarify a little bit? What does that mean?
Sure. HR people are sensitive about sharing people's salaries and information, so it was important that I identify that entire dollar amount is not a paycheck to Mr. Cox. It's a payment to the firm, and then the firm itself has their own compensation strategy that they use to within their own shop, which we did not per se study.
Does that number go to overhead expenses, or is it all for services?
I wouldn't know that off the top of my head. Mr. Cox could respond to that more efficiently.
It's a factor rolled into the hourly rate that is charged. Just it's not intended to go dollar for dollar for any overhead expenses. It's just a percentage that's added to the total to reflect that the money that comes in goes into our coffers, is spent on staff, on attorneys, on utilities, on rent, and all of that.
But the invoices that come to the city are for time billed by the attorneys. There's not separate line items for color copies, for travel, for those types of expenses.
There are some expense categories that per the agreement are charged at an agreed upon rate. In the case of Lakewood, I don't charge for travel time because I'm coming here every day for the most part. And there's some other expenses that just don't come up very often, faxing and copying and such. We don't do that sort of thing. Lakewood has the functions available here. But per the agreement, there are categories of expenses. But for the most part, the money that's paid in is based on the hourly rate, which is set based on the experience of the attorneys and includes that overtime function. So it's not getting paid directly to individuals. It's getting paid into the firm and then spread out among our various expense categories.
Did we receive, and thank you for that, Mr. Cox, did we receive any information, and this is probably that highly confidential part, anything on salaries of the in-house folks at those other jurisdictions, Fort Collins, Thornton?
We do have salary information that's a public record that we can share and include. It's not as targeted as the work that we did on the assessment. It's more of a general assessment that we gather when we do our classification work. So we have some of that information we can provide.
So we know what the Fort Collins Chief General Counsel is being paid?
I believe so.
Okay. Thank you.
Just two quick highlights too. When you look at populations, we also have to keep in mind again, while Longmont's smaller than the city of Lakewood, their operations, they operate a utility. So they have a lot of different operations that the city of Lakewood also doesn't have. And you'd mentioned Douglas County as being small. I think they're quite large.
Yeah, I may have stated that, yes.
Mr. Cox.
Just very quickly, because I was listening and writing at the same time when Jeff was talking about the which jurisdictions use in-house and which use a contract. Longmont is actually a contract, an in-house situation. And one that's not on the list because they did not respond, I think, was Wheat Ridge, which is a contract with Mr. Dahl for some 24 years now. So I just wanted to clarify, among the local jurisdictions, Longmont is in-house, Wheat Ridge is not.
Ms. Hodson.
Can I also help clarify? Westminster has an in-house, and it's Wheat Ridge that's the, Wheat Ridge, like Mr. Cox just said, is the one that's outsourced. So Mr. Dolan misspoke. Instead of saying Wheat Ridge, he said Westminster.
Nobody's in the outhouse. Mr. Abel.
Good presentation, quite thorough. It might have been handy to have the PowerPoint in front of us so that we could go back and forth and refer to those things. And I remember a few years back when I believe Mr. Windhorst had half the contracts in Jefferson County, and another firm, I believe Mr. Dahl's firm, had most of the other half. So times have changed. There have been, as I was scrolling the internet in preparation for tonight, I noticed that some communities have claimed different kinds of savings with in-house attorneys. Camden, New Jersey, for instance, says the number of settlements they have made since having an in-house attorney is much lower, and that their liability cost as a consequence were also much lower. Did we look at those sort of financial advantages?
We didn't investigate that specific city, Councilman. What I would tell you is that based on each organization's risk tolerance, they may have good outcomes without knowing the details. Again, I have a working knowledge of what that might look like and sound like. However, it's really difficult to compare an outcome or a savings based on a different organization's risk tolerance. I'm sorry to say.
And a lot of that may be anecdotal. It's difficult to compare with other communities without knowing their staffing levels and salaries and outside legal costs and that sort of thing. And in one instance in the rundown of outside attorneys, I believe you mentioned in Lakewood, there was a cost of $299,207, but then you annualized it to, it was 300 grand or so. Why did we not annualize each of those other years?
The other 2 years we had a full year of data. The first 2016 was a split year where Mr. Cox's previous firm was under a different agreement. So,
okay, thank you for that. That's all I have right now. Thank you.
Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. It was a very nice presentation. And you will provide us with the PowerPoint? Perfect. I very much liked your presentation. I'm curious why Tim didn't give the information himself about his office. I think it would have been powerful for you to have told us yourself.
So, Ms. Hodson, go ahead.
I can answer that because the request was to do an audit on the department, and audits are typically done by the Human Resource Department. The whole idea is to have a fair and unbiased review of the operations and function of the department. So, however, Mr. Cox is here to answer questions if you'd like additional information.
Also, I noticed, and maybe you've already covered this, in 2015, the outside legal was about $429,000. Could you please talk a little bit why it was so high that year as in comparison to others?
yeah, without going into detail, that was the year that we concluded a fairly significant work-related on-the-job event within the police department.
I think I know what you're dealing with. It honestly feels to me that with a city the size of Lakewood, having counsel for 4 days a week is maybe a little shy of what our needs are. And I would suggest that we would have 5-day-a-week counsel. One way or another. Until your contract was renegotiated when the whole thing changed for you, Tim, were we totally outsourced at that point, or were we a hybrid?
It was basically the same arrangement under the prior law firm, whereby I was here as the city attorney on 4 days a week. And to be clear, I work for Lakewood on Wednesdays too. I work for Lakewood 5 days a week. I have no other clients. I occasionally will confer with my colleagues when they have a question, just as they will confer with me when I have a question about Lakewood, but I don't advise those other communities that the firm represents. The significance of Wednesdays and the fifth day is simply that when we started this process and we had a law firm that we were building to serve local communities, we acknowledged right from the get-go the importance of me having some presence in our firm offices, even if it's only 1 day a week when we can have a staff meeting, a partners meeting, what have you. But when I'm not meeting with staff or meeting with my partners or dealing with some administrative matter on a Wednesday, I'm working for Lakewood. It's billed by the hours that I actually work, as opposed to the sort of flat fee arrangement for the rest of the rest of the days of the week. So I'm not off work on Wednesdays. Might be nice, but it's part of the work week, and I bill time to Lakewood when I work time for Lakewood on Wednesdays, or for that matter, as Jeff said, if on the weekends things come up that are of any significance, that would be included as well. So I don't want anybody to think that it's a 4 day a week arrangement. It's 4 days that I'm in the offices, and a fifth day that I'm available by phone or email or what have you.
We share you at that point with your firm.
To some degree, yeah.
Okay. Was there outreach to Denver? I didn't see Denver on there.
We did not reach out to Denver. I spent some time in Denver as the HR director for a few years. So I had a working knowledge of it. They're a fairly significant variance in legal organization. They're huge. So
In-house, outsourced?
largely in-house.
Okay.
And they on the risk tolerance, they're very aggressive on their strategy. Is to my perception is their strategy has historically been to defend any and all to the extent that they can. So
Okay. It obviously the trend with larger cities is in-house. Yeah. I personally think that I can understand that. You know, the only thing that I can compare this to is my world in healthcare and in a hospital. When St. Anthony's outsourced the food department, there was a loss of oneness, if you will, with the employees that formerly worked with the hospital or were hired by the hospital. It really created a very different environment for them. That was them versus the hospital. Even though you have the same mission and the same buy-in isn't really quite there. Like I say, that's the world that I come from. I can understand when you go from an in-house to an outsourced model. It just, I'm not sure it's healthy for the organization. I guess this is probably not the time to ask the number of court cases that we've had and the outcomes, and was that outsourced and that kind of thing. I'd be curious to know.
So, and I would say we have that opportunity. We should be having your report coming forth in the next few weeks, which would probably include all of our litigation and different things.
Okay, I'll look forward to that. Thank you. That's all for now.
And just to clarify, the city of Denver appoints their city attorney and then probably has 130, 140 in-house lawyers throughout. So, Mr. Roybal?
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick point of clarification. First, thank you for the great presentation, very informative. I want to kind of focus in on the municipal courts. You kind of touched on a few things, and I wanted to kind of get some clarification. Do we have a budget for the municipal courts, or their budget separate from the city attorney's budget?
The municipal court as an operation does have a standalone budget. The city attorney's office budget covers the prosecution, the investigators, and the administration. So their budget is aligned with city attorney's office. Scott Hefty and the chief presiding judge cover and develop their own budget for the municipal courts.
So, okay, and the investigators and the attorney are all in-house, I take it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Ms. Gutwein?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this really in-depth presentation. I think that it really provided a good picture of what the city attorney does. I think that sometimes if you're a community member, you might think that all you do is come here at 7 o'clock and answer our questions. But I think that it's really helpful to see all the different pieces and the different ways that you interact with our city in every single department on a day-to-day basis. And so I think it's just really helpful for me also to just look at this and see how interwoven the legal department is with everything that we do in the city. So thank you. I have a couple of questions. You mentioned that you one of the reasons that an organization would do something like this is to identify new trends and potential areas that we can, make improvements over our system. I know it sounds like you continually do this already, but are there anything that you identified that we could potentially improve upon?
Thank you, Councilor. As we went through the process, I would say a couple of things. There are, as an organization, we have a strategy to manage paper and control paper and documents. That's an area that consumes a fair amount of capacity within the city attorney's office. I know that they have partnered or begun the process of partnering with city clerk's office to help automate and track and image some of that information and actually be able to access that. Although that seems like a small thing, that it's actually a really significant level of effort. So I know that that's an area. Other than that, what I would say is the staff focus is designed specifically around our current demands and our current direction. So should the council or should city attorney decide to redirect staff, I would say that that's probably an area that he would be open to. The only other caveat I would say is anytime we can use technology as an organization to streamline how we manage information, share information. I know the municipal courts are in the midst of launching a new records management and system in place. Again, that technology is always a wonderful tool as a guiding principle. But specifically, I did not identify any major events that needed to be re-engineered.
Great, that's helpful. Yeah, anything that we can do to automate and reduce paper, that's great. Thank you. One other question I had, and you probably answered this, but primarily the things that we're outsourcing is when we have special cases, essentially, or need for expertise. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Great. Well, then I just wanted to comment on that as well, because I had the opportunity to work on 2 different committees that we outsourced to special attorney, one of whom I see is in the room. But we did our workplace harassment policy, and then we also did our campaign finance policy, and we were able to get experts in in those fields and really create, I think, great legislation that I know other cities have adopted. Maybe we should bill them for taking our policies. So anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. And yeah, I think that's all. I feel like this gives us good tools to communicate with the public about what our city attorney does, and also provide some explanation of how we compare and how our model is efficient compared to other cities. So thank you.
Mr. LeBear.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you to our HR director. I appreciate the slide, good information. Just a quick question, and this is kind of what Councilor Goodwin already said, and it's kind of already been said here, but I just want to make sure I understand it. We've basically doubled our special project expenditure, essentially from 30,000 to 60,000. I think if I had the number right, is that correct? Something like that, right?
Yeah, I think from 36 to 78.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And I guess my question is, it's direct to our city attorney, which is just sort of, I want to make sure I understand this right. So how do we, all this extra work, this is your firm helps pick up some of all the different staff demands, is that correct?
The numbers you're talking about are additional legal services provided by attorneys in my firm. For example, Kathy Guckenberger is here. She has been advising the HR department on personnel matters for several years now. It's an area of expertise for her. And she's also been assisting as Jenna Roth has transitioned from strictly not that I'm minimizing it, but the supervisory role of the prosecutors to the police legal advisor role. Kathy assists with management of litigation, tracking what's happening, communicating with outside counsel. So that's a function that we're using the expertise in our firm to provide support to the city's in-house attorneys.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that was my question. I'm just trying to get a sense of capacity. You know, when there's a need, we have the extra capacity because you can just basically bill that way. Okay, thanks.
Ms. Harrison?
Thank you. Ditto, excellent presentation. I learned a lot in a lot of different ways. And you're right, you love details. So thank you very much. One thing from an HR perspective that we would see, I think in-house attorneys all get the same level of benefits in terms of health insurance and 401k and everything else that any other employee would be receiving. Whereas right now with our hybrid method that we have, Tim bills us on an hourly fee, but we don't contribute to his 401k or his health insurance or anything else. And nor do we have the expenses of his staff that's doing that. So that's kind of an area where we would have a savings over our current model versus an in-house. I don't know about the workload, whether or not that would, make up that difference. But I wanted to just kind of point that just to make sure that I understood. Now, the other attorneys, i.e. Greg, you're on city benefits. You're actually a city employee, correct?
That's correct.
I'm saying that so that the public can hear that as well.
I'm a full-time city employee.
That's what I was thinking, that Tim is the only one that is an outsourced contract at this point. So, thank you.
Ms. Franks?
Thanks. I saved this question for last because it wasn't part of my request for the audit. But I wanted to identify whether, as you were going through the exercise of that functional kind of list of all those functional duties, did you take it a step further and say which ones of those could be done by a paralegal in order for to say, well, these 5 duties, these 10 duties, what could be done by other staff? And you don't have to answer that tonight. I'm just wondering, did you guys go to that level of, when you looked at the functional line items, were there things that were able to be identified as maybe being able to be shifted from an attorney to a paralegal?
Thank you, Counselor. One of the things I would tell you is each year we do a workforce planning process where we talk to the department heads and we look at each of their head count and we talk about a number of things as far as succession planning, transition planning, things along those lines. It's not uncommon for us as an HR department to coach, counsel, stick our nose in other people's business and say, what about this and what about that? It's not unheard of for us to do that. That's one of the things the city manager likes that we do, is help the organization to see things differently. Over the last several years, we've had great conversations with the city attorney's office about how to perhaps evolve or change. And we've seen that, as one of our city attorneys retired last year, we saw this nice evolution with Jenna and kind of an evolution of one of our prosecutors. So we see that, and they've been really successful about doing that. As far as splitting out some of the work, there's clearly opportunities in every business to be able to say, that transactional work could be done by a lower hourly paid employee or automated, quite honestly. And that work is harder to do because of the systems and all the things that I kind of talk a little bit about. But we continuously have that conversation with the departments, and city attorney's office has been quite open to the idea. So.
Well, thank you. And I really wanted just to call the public's attention that that's part of our normal process. That's a process that any HR, and are you guys now HR versus ER? Have we moved from the emergency room to HR? But I did want to make sure that the public really has benefit of that I know you and I had discussed that, but it is something that as you're reviewing those duties, you're always looking for, can you automate it? Can you shift that work somewhere when you find repetitive or routine tasks? And so I just really wanted to highlight that for council and for the public.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. Actually, Councilwoman Harrison brought up a good point that I hadn't thought of. When you outsource, you're not covering benefits and overhead. I guess I'd like to know, Tim, when you charge the city, are you able to defray the costs of the overhead and benefits for your employees that's adequate to the amount of time that they're giving and what's being asked of them?
Counselor, I guess the way I'd answer that is, we have several other municipal clients. As I said, I don't represent them, but we have the same issue with all those clients. The firm, as an employer, as an organization, provides benefits to its employees, and then we bill our clients for the work that we do. And like any other business, you want to make sure that the money coming in offsets the money going out. So I guess I'd say to this point, our collection of clients and the revenue we gain from them is adequate to cover our expenses, including benefits. As it happens, I don't take benefits from my firm. I get them through my wife's company. But that's a benefit that's available to us as employees of that organization.
So basically, we are being charged to help offset those expenses. Yeah.
Yes.
It's kind of a wash, really. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Abel?
Thank you. Somebody mentioned the Denver Attorney's Office staffing, and I have a picture of them here, and they take up nearly the entire stairway leading up to the city and county building. On the other hand, Fort Worth, Texas, which has a similar population and similar duties, has 36. So I guess it is priority driven. One of your slides was about community comparable staffing levels. Can you put a footnote on that when you send us the PowerPoint? Because I would like to see the cost of those staffing levels and which of those cities are in-house counsel and which are not.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Charlie will be fine.
Okay, any other questions from council? Well done. I mean, that was a great dive into this world, and I think a lot of folks learned something new. I too learned something new. For the community, this presentation will be available on our website, and yeah, enjoy your evening. Very nice. So let's go into reports. I'll go on my right. Mr. Roybal?
No report.
Ms. Gutwein?
I don't even know if I have a report. I was not expecting you to come to me. Sorry.
We'll skip you, Mr. Skilling. Mr. LeBear?
No report.
Mr. Abel?
No report.
Ms. Harrison?
I'll follow suit, no report.
Ms. Franks? Ms. Johnson?
I'd just like to mention something. I noticed on the Friday report that it referred to the Strategic Growth Initiative as the Residential Growth Initiative. And I guess although they're technically the same, I think we need to use the correct language of the ordinance or the piece of legislation that we passed. It was a Strategic Growth Initiative. It was not titled Residential Growth Initiative. If somebody could please fix that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Ms. Gutwein?
Thank you. Just one quick thing. We have in Southern Gables in Ward 5 our 6th annual seed swap this Saturday at 10:30. It's at Green Gables Elementary School. It's really fun, and it kind of kicks off the community garden season, and people can get seeds, and they have a planting station for kids, and it is wonderful. And then also I had the chance to go to the pinwheel garden planting this morning. And it actually takes more work to get those things in the ground than you might think. But if you want to participate, you can get more information at Ralston House to support their mission in ending child abuse. Thank you.
Yeah, you'll see those pinwheels up all over the place, and I think they're $5, maybe, if you want to buy one. All right, $5. You can buy a garden for $250. Okay. So I have a couple of announcements. We celebrated our volunteers, National Volunteer Month, and last week I was at CCU and was able to attend one of their chapel services as I had met with one of their student body president. His name is Ben, and he had asked months ago what they could do in the city, and I told him there were a lot of different needs. And so this whole month they're doing different things, from volunteering at senior homes to the Action Center, serving at the table. So homeless type issues, just great needs out in our community. So hats off to the CCU student body for heading out and trying to do that. Went to the styrofoam ball. Ms. Gillickson was there to join me, as well as Jonathan Wachtel, and that was the South Lakewood Elementary School 5th graders, and they are on a quest to get styrofoam out of their lunches. And once again, they did a great job, and we can share their link for their change.org petition to do so, and they invited the county school officials as well. And it was a good give and take about education. Why does the school district use styrofoam? Because it's $4 or 4 cents a plate, right? Rather than other things. But hopefully they'll move a little, get a little bit of action, a little bit of progress on this year's initiative. So if you are willing to, please help get the word out for the 5th graders. Jeffco Schools had a bunch of us out, and we got to hear about a lot of really cool things going on in our schools, from mental health awareness to building programs that are just really fascinating to see what our schools are doing. So I want to thank the district for inviting all of council out to Dunston for that celebration. Ms. Hodson, hats off to your staff for the 50th anniversary events. Had the opportunity to go to yesterday and today a Beatles experience Friday night, and it was awesome. And the community was really excited to be a part of Lakewood's 50th and to remember 1969 for those of you that were there. A reminder that we'll have our city manager review coming up, and you did receive an email with that reviewing information. Please, please, please have that to Mr. Dolan by Monday morning, 8 a.m. I'm not going to chase it down. Please do that. Thank you to those folks that handed in information about the census. We got a couple of names, but we're just going to go forth now and put together a committee. So we have to get that done. And then I think that's all that I have. Agent Hunt, thank you for hanging out. It's an early night for you. Ms. Greer, anything? Mr. Cox?
Just quickly to thank Jeff and Corey from HR for their efforts. I had no idea how much work they'd put into this. And to all of you for your close attention to the information. And to call out Councilor Gutwein particularly for recognizing that this is not the only thing we do for the city, but it is almost always the best part.
Hodson, anything? All right. Great. With that, we are adjourned at 8:41. Thank you all.